So my grandparents donated their whole bodies. I'd imagine what it was like to get dissected. Body donation tends to become a family tradition. Because most parts of the world don't have body donor programs, they will ship bodies in. The plastinates that they were using were bodies from executed criminals in China. You would be chopped up, you would be cut up. A lot of people donate their body because they actually want to be dissected. They would rather get dissected than have a person at the funeral, because it's quite easy to sign up, right? Because you die and then you get cut up.
Don't Be Caught Dead, the show bringing stories of death back to life. Here's your host, Catherine Ashton.
Today I'm speaking with Jackie Dent. Jackie is the author of The Great Dead Body Teachers, a book exploring whole body donation and the world of human anatomy, which was longlisted for the 2023 Walkley Book Award and the Mark and Everett Moran NIB Literary Award. She is an independent journalist, communications specialist and researcher, and she's currently completing her PhD in International Relations at the University of Sydney. Jackie's career spans major media outlets, international humanitarian work, and event curation. She has had the opportunity to live and work across Australia, the Philippines, and multiple global locations. Thanks for being with us, Jackie.
Hello, Catherine.
Now, Jackie, I had the very exciting opportunity to hear you speak at the Sydney Death and Dying Festival last year, and I was fascinated that you wrote a book on whole body donation. It is such a secret topic. So how did you get started?
It's interesting what happens with journalism, how sometimes an idea is just sitting right in front of you. So my grandparents donated their whole bodies. My grandmother, Julie, donated her body in 1969, and my grandfather, Julie, yes, his name was Julie, in 1980. And they went to the University of Queensland. So it was always this kind of thing in the family, but it was never really a big deal. My parents were sort of like, whatever, like they donated their bodies. And admittedly, I always found it like a really weird thing. Like as a kid, I just always thought, and I'd imagine what it was like to get dissected. Sort of 6 years ago now, or just before the coronavirus hit, Mum and Dad and I had a drink with their next door neighbour. And the young girl of the house said to me, Jackie, you're a journalist. You'd probably be interested in where I work. I work at this medical surgical facility. And we, the students are cutting up bodies, but they don't really, do full dissection. They get body parts shipped in from America and they don't really do full body dissection. I was like, why are the body parts being flown in? And she said, I don't know. And so Mum and I kind of, walked home and I said, that's pretty weird. That's kind of sad if people aren't donating their bodies anymore. And she said, yeah, it is actually. And so literally I went home, got on the internet, and started researching, and about half an hour later was instantly struck by the fact that there was just no information about whole body donation. Like if you went to the website for a medical school, it was very vague, well, too vague for my liking. And I guess I just started wondering, like, what happened to their bodies? Like, what happens and what's with the body parts? And, basically it just started from there. I just went on this massive odyssey to find out what happened to their bodies.
And what is whole body donation?
Yeah, see, that's an excellent question because a lot of people get confused between whole body donation and organ donation. So whole body donation is usually you would have signed up with the university beforehand. So you have to fill out paperwork with the university. It's always good to have your next of kin aware that this is what you want to do. And then you die, you're dead, and within 24 hours, your whole body is sent to a university. It's very different to organ donation where people will be, unfortunately, have been in some sort of accident or something, and then parts of their body are given to another person. So it's very important to distinguish between the two. Whole body donation is your whole dead body goes to a university, and it goes on the beginning of a wonderful journey, depending on your point of view.
And so how does one go about this? Like, has it always been the case? Like, why do we have it? Why is whole body donation important?
Well, I mean, anatomy is sort of the basis of medicine, really. Like, when you go to the doctor, you sit in front of them, and when a surgeon cuts you open, they've got your body. So, medical science needs bodies. They need to look inside. They need to know how you work. And so, I mean, this is what happened in researching my book, is that anatomy is an extraordinarily old science, and it has gone through so many phases. And, a lot of it is attached to the politics of the body. You'd think that you've got a dead body, you cut it open and you have a look inside. And no, this is not the case. Through time and space, the way that humans have approached the corpse, especially for scientific purposes, has had so many different meanings. And so what you find with contemporary anatomy, which was the thing that was very fascinating to me, was that it was very hard to find out actually what happens. I mean, the University of Queensland didn't really want to talk to me. The University of Sydney didn't want to talk to me. But the University of Melbourne actually was really, really helpful. And the University of New South Wales was great. So it really depended on the anatomist that I contacted. It is a very, very hidden world. So that's why people probably don't really know that much about it. But the other thing too is that people only really find out about body donation through someone they know directly doing it. So it tends to become a family tradition. It's only through really knowing about it that people engage with it. So, in terms of what happens to your body these days, every medical school is different. But, you would be chopped up, you would be cut up. There's all these different pathways that you can go through at different universities. And ultimately, your body will be used by the scientists, the physiotherapists, and the surgeons of the future.
I suppose that makes total sense. The surgeons that operate on you to do anything from taking your appendix out to, I suppose, a knee reconstruction, I suppose they need to have a bit of a test on that before they use human subjects. So I suppose it does make sense that they would need to use the human body to practice on.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's interesting because there's a real shift, dissection programs are very expensive. And so medical schools now are increasingly using technology. In the book, I went to an international anatomy conference in London, and it was pretty amazing, the software that was on display and the technology. But most anatomists that you speak to would argue that we really need the human body, like we really need a dead body to study. So across Australia, every weekend, there are surgeons practicing on body parts. So I went to a head and neck workshop for one weekend, which was very confronting, but it was also incredible as a way for me to realize, the importance of dissection, what surgeons can learn by practicing on bodies, but also just the shifts that have happened over time. If you go to a doctor who's sort of maybe 65 and over, they're more than likely to have spent hours and hours. They would have spent 1 year dissecting a full human body. They would have spent second year dissecting a head. They know their anatomy, like they have an extraordinary knowledge of anatomy. Whereas these days, the medical students really just don't have the dissection experience that they once had, to the point now that the Royal College of Surgeons are sort of like calling on for more anatomy to be reintroduced to the medical program because, anatomical knowledge is waning.
And is it because there's less bodies readily available? Is that why there's been a decline in anatomy and using the bodies to, I suppose, train our surgeons?
No, there's sort of, in Australia, we have a kind of a steady supply of bodies. But, well, that was another thing. It's very hard to find out how many donations happen each year. It's not a very easy thing to find out. But basically, no, they have enough bodies. The problem is that dissection takes a long time and it's a very intense process. If you go to YouTube now, you can watch dissection. There's lots and lots of dissection videos. There's dissection influencers. And you can see that if you have a full dead body, first the person needs to be embalmed, or in some instances they'll just be frozen. But, an embalmed body, there's a lot of fat and fascia, and it is kind of quite fascinating. It's a complicated process and it actually really requires a lot of skill. It's not an easy thing to do. So there's just not that room in the medical program anymore for students to spend days on end dissecting.
So what does that mean for us when we compare the surgeons that are practicing nowadays to where anatomy was a main focus? And you were saying that they made it something that you would practice on for a year or so.
Look, I think just things change, and surgeons these days have to, do anatomical courses, like they do practice. So if you're a doctor and then you want to become a specialist in a certain field, you will have to have a certain level of anatomical knowledge. And what happens is that some, doctors that want to become specialists will work in an anatomy lab for a year and, teach and pick up their skills that way. So it's quite diverse. I mean, it's very fascinating that in the olden days, the technicians, the people that worked in the laboratories, cutting up the dead, the professional, the people that had the real skill at dissection, they were often men, but you'll find these days that it's mainly young women and women who are the technicians and dissectors. So I think that's an interesting thing that, you've got women that are the midwives bringing babies into the world, and then you've got all these women in the anatomy lab that are kind of like, there at the end cutting people up for science.
And why do you think that shift is?
I don't know. That's a very interesting question. I've spoken to some young women. I've spoken to the women about it. It's not a very well paid job, actually. So women often tend to be in underpaid jobs, like, not paid as well as men. I'm not sure. I would probably need to look into that a bit more. But it's very interesting that anatomy, the technician side of it, is quite female dominated.
And what were some of the other things that you found that were quite surprising as you started to embark on this entire world that you'd known nothing about when you first started?
Oh, well, where to start?
I know, I'm sure there's quite a lot. There's so much that I have to ask you. So,
it's quite endless. I think the one thing is I thought at first that I would just be studying dissection, right? I thought I would just talk to some anatomists. And in the book, I tracked down older surgeons who were studying at the University of Queensland at the time to get a sense of, what it was like. And, maybe one of them had actually dissected my grandmother or my grandfather. So I thought I'd just be studying dissection, but no, it moved into the world of embalming, which in itself is this whole other extraordinary realm. And then it also moved into the idea of anatomical museums. Like, did my grandparents end up one of their body parts in an anatomical museum? Or there's the world of anatomical art. My grandparents, were they sketched? Were they drawn by someone? And then there were so many other kind of themes around science and the soul. What was it like for the young students and the anatomists to dissect? Did they have ideas about the soul? Was it confronting for them? It really was a world of rabbit holes. And I kept falling into rabbit holes and just being so interested that, I just found it a very incredible world, actually. And to be honest, now, this is going to sound a bit Celine Dion of me, but we really are quite beautiful on the inside. And I think one thing that I found very striking is that a lot of the anatomists that I interviewed really love dissecting. They kind of get lost in it and they just talk about how beautiful the body is. A lot of them will specialize in a body part. So someone might be really into the feet and hands. Someone else might be really into the thorax. Other people are into the brain. So I just found that really curious as well. Not only kind of the history side and all the different elements of anatomy, but also how the anatomists felt about what they were doing, but also what's happening internationally. Australia is gold standard. We only accept donated bodies, but in most parts of the world, you still have a situation where people who are poor or they die in a mental hospital will be dissected, which I think is a very political and complex issue for the international anatomical community.
And there was someone that you met when you went to the UK and attended that conference that had actually done some mapping of the different body donors throughout the world. Was that right?
Yeah, so that was Dr. Andreas Winkelmann, who is a really, really incredible character, actually, and has done a lot of really significant work kind of in the more ethical side of the anatomical community. And he was looking at basically where medical schools were getting their bodies from and sort of did find this kind of quite sad statistic that, in most parts of the world, people didn't have body donor programs. I recently went to the Philippines. I grew up there as a child, and I guess since I've written the book, I've become quite interested in anatomy. And so I went and visited the anatomists there, and sadly, they don't, even though the Philippines has a huge population, it's a very Catholic country and people just are not donating their bodies. They have no bodies. So what they do is they use bodies from people that have died in a mental hospital and their bodies are unclaimed and then they're sent for dissection, which I personally feel is quite sad. Some people might have different views on that. But they also use plastinates. So this is another big area of anatomy where, because most parts of the world, this is what Andreas's work highlighted, because most parts of the world don't have body donor programs, they will ship bodies in. So in the Arab world, they will bring bodies in from the US. The US has quite a large body brokerage system, so people sell their bodies to science and body parts. And so, for example, in Turkey, I spoke to an anatomist there who he didn't ship bodies, but he says they cost around $15,000. And then you also have the plastinates. So I don't know if you've ever been to that Body Worlds exhibition.
No, but I have read a lot about it.
Yeah, so Gunther von Hagen's really revolutionized embalming, and some of your listeners might know these, elaborate human bodies in particular poses. And so he really revolutionized that. So a lot of people will buy plastinates. Unfortunately, when I went to the Philippines, the plastinates that they were using were bodies from executed criminals in China. And so, yeah, there's still, anatomy still has some kind of, in parts of the world, it is still kind of a pretty edgy and ethically kind of complex area.
It certainly sounds like it. And tell me a little bit more about the history of it. How has anatomy changed over the period of time, perhaps in Australia and even in context to the world, Jackie?
Well, I mean, people have been dissecting, the earliest known dissector is a man called Herophilus, and he lived sort of in ancient Alexandria around 300 BC. And it's very interesting. He was a Greek man who moved to Alexandria in Egypt. And it kind of makes sense that this is where you have sort of these first records in the West of dissection, because I guess the Egyptians had a tradition of embalming.
Mm.
So they were opening up bodies. There wasn't the taboo around bodies. If you go back a lot earlier, there is an Indian anatomist and dissector called Susruta. I think I got that name correct. He's known for doing the world's first nose jobs, which I would love to see in ancient nose surgery. But because there were all these taboos around touching the dead, he came up with this kind of crafty method where he would put a body in a cage, in like sort of a wooden cage, and he would leave the body in a river and let all the skin come off, and that way he could look in and see what was happening. He was also able to dissect toddlers, because in Hinduism it wasn't a taboo to dissect anyone under the age of 2. So he was dissecting little kids and people who were in these sort of bamboo cages. From there, it's a mysterious road. They think that dissection was made dormant and then it traveled over to, you have Avicenna, who was an Iranian scholar who people believe was dissecting. And then sort of over the last 1,000 years, we've had very different approaches to anatomy. Probably one of my favorite dissection stories, a very fascinating one, it's called a holy anatomy, and it happened around the 1300s, I think, if I'm correct. And it was a woman called Chiara de Montefalco, and she was a nun. She was an abbess in Montefalco in Italy, and she died, and she was very, very religious. But in the lead up to her death, she kept sort of saying, I've got Jesus in my heart. I have Jesus in my heart. So once she died, the nuns decided to cut her open and see what was inside. And sure enough, they found all these signs of God in her heart. They found like gallstones. They found 3 of them. So they thought that was a sign of the Trinity. And so it became kind of like, it sent this sort of ripples through the community, and people came to, because they thought that, she was a saint. And the reason we know so much about this holy anatomy from this time is that there was a move to have her canonized. And so after she died, there was an enormous inquiry where 400 people gave submissions. And so you have all these very early records of this holy anatomy, which I just find an extraordinary story, because also it was conducted by women.
Yeah.
I mean, the other thing too is that even though there's all these ideas that there are taboos around dissection, I think that probably people were just dissecting, because you'll be amazed to know this, but there's a kind of a busy feminist medieval dissection scholarship scene where you have women who are looking at female dissection. And there was a period in Italy where you had aristocratic women who would leave in their will saying, can you please dissect me? I haven't been well and I want to find out what happened so that my daughter doesn't get sick. And also, women died so much in childbirth. So you imagine that, if you had a dead woman there, the doctors would maybe have a look, cut the woman open to see what might have happened, what the obstruction was. A really important thing to know about anatomy, it's almost like the equivalent of, I guess, Einstein or Copernicus, is a man named Andreas Vesalius. And he published a book in 1543, which basically changed the history of science. It's a huge book, huge drawings of the human body, very dramatic, beautiful drawings. And he was the first anatomist to actually cut open the dead. Up until then, there were all these rituals around how you cut up the dead. They also referred to a very old book by a man called Galen. I won't go down that rabbit hole, but it's important to know about Vesalius. And then over time, since then, I suppose dissection and art had a close relationship, because the only way a medical student could learn would be through pictures and drawing. So, you've got Leonardo da Vinci's work. You have a lot of incredibly beautiful work, over a 500-year period, up until probably in the last 100 years, where I would say, quite sadly, the anatomy lab has been completely closed to artists, and it's now become sort of quite a sealed off scientific space.
That's interesting because it has always been one of those classic roles that there has always been generally an artist associated with the different areas of anatomy drawing or facial reconstruction. I know that Darrell Lindsay from the famous Lindsay family, when he was at the Slade School of Art, he was responsible for actually drawing the facial reconstruction of what was going on after people came back from the war. So it really has sort of been hand in hand, hasn't it? And I love the two women that you spoke to in relation to their research into how they have been looking at sculpture and how that has been telling a story about anatomy through time.
Yeah, one of the people I profiled is a British artist called Eleanor Crook. She's a painter, sculptor, and drawer who actually spends time in anatomy labs. She's one of the few people in the world who is still allowed in, and she actually teaches artists. Globally, there are a handful of medical programs that allow, artists in to draw, but generally it's sort of become quite a taboo area. I also interviewed a contemporary medical illustrator called Marie Dauenheimer, who has an incredible story about, from maybe 30 years ago, being a young medical illustrator and how she would go into and watch surgeries, how she would draw surgeries, until now, though, where she has quite an in-depth knowledge of anatomy, but these days there's only really a handful of artists that are still allowed access to anatomy labs.
And one of the things that fascinated me about how one of the sculptures had depicted the internal organs and the intestines in one of the sculptures as being vertical instead of being horizontal. And I believe that the idea was the fact that they may have seen that person perhaps, with their cut open at some stage. And can you explain a little bit of that one? Because I thought that that was fascinating.
Oh, okay. Yeah, actually, this is another area. This was a forensic anatomist and a death historian, actually, who were researching. They're called transy tombs. So they're these sort of strange sculptures that are littered around Europe of very rich people who are kind of emaciated and look really yucky. And it's a really bizarre story. So, yeah, they were looking at these sculptures, and some of them are quite old, and they started thinking, well, this is pre-Vesalius. You know how I mentioned Vesalius before? And so some of these are quite old, and so they're thinking that whoever sculpted these figures had dissected or had seen dead bodies. And yes, they think that one of the tombs in England is probably, maybe they'd been to an execution and maybe seen someone disemboweled. I mean, it's quite incredible. Like, why would a very rich person want to have a tomb of themselves looking so horrible? And sort of the argument is it's connected to purgatory, and that if you and I were walking through the church and we saw this tomb, this person would be in purgatory, and so we would pray for them, and then that way they would eventually make it to heaven. So they served a very, important spiritual purpose, but for contemporary scholars, they also have sort of anatomical interest.
And on a recent trip to Italy, my husband got to the stage where he asked us not to go into any more churches because of the amount of churches in Italy that we found that had a deceased saint or possible saint in the catacombs, and people are still praying to them now. The body is there. There's even ossuaries that we've attended overseas. How much has religion and anatomy played a part? Are they friend or foe?
Well, that's actually, yeah, I mean, that's a fascinating question. I would say they're probably both. And I mean, in terms of anatomy now, in most parts of the world, I would say that to the anatomists, it's a foe. Because of religious beliefs, they can't, all throughout Africa, anatomists can't, it's not easy to get access to bodies, all throughout China, the Middle East. I mean, it is really important that, of course, you have to respect these religious traditions, and they play a big part in body donation. The one thing that I found really incredible was that people had done some research with medical students about the idea of the soul, and also with anatomists and how they thought about the dead. And there are different parts of the bodies that people will react differently to. Students have a lot of weird feelings around the brain. They'll feel particularly, intense about the heart. And so these are kind of very powerful cultural ideas, but I also think there is sort of an element of the spirit. I mean, it's interesting. One of the anatomists I profiled in the book, Sven Kunkel, had a very funny story. Well, someone might not find it funny, but I said, did you ever have any spiritual feelings? And he said, look, I've worked in anatomy labs for years. I've never seen anything like. But he said that one time, one of his friends lay on an anatomy table in Germany. This is years ago when they were younger, and a poor cleaning lady walked through at night, and he put his hand out. And I mean, the poor woman, you would have had a heart attack on the spot. I did actually collect a few anatomical ghost stories. Like, I think that, to be in an anatomy lab at night would definitely conjure certain feelings. And even during the day, I imagine, apparently, particularly for students for the first time, when they go into an anatomy lab, it can be an intense experience. But yeah, without a doubt, religion and the body, of course, yes, friend and foe.
When you're talking about, I was wondering if you can recall, in the book you mention a process that you were taken through before you went into your first anatomy lab. You refer to it, there's an acronym or something like that, that you were actually to visualize what was in the lab before you actually walked into it. So it helped prepare you mentally for what you were about to see. Do you remember what that acronym is?
No, but it's actually, so it was Quentin Fogg, who's a lovely anatomist at the University of Melbourne, and he studied all around the world, but he was working in Scotland. And yeah, he used certain techniques to help people prepare for the situation of going into anatomy lab, explaining to people, especially for first year medical students, what they would see, how it would be. I never really had that experience. I did go into an anatomy lab, but it's a very closed off space. To be honest, I was pretty disappointed that after 4 years of researching this, kind of seriously, it was still very, very, very hard for me to get access to an anatomy lab. I eventually did get into a surgical workshop, but some universities wanted to consult with their lawyers first. No wonder all of us wonder what happens there. It is a very, very closed off space. And, I think for the medical students that go in there for the first time, yeah, it would definitely be confronting. And I think that's why you do have these sort of silly stories, that kids do silly things. And these days, if you did one silly thing, if you took a photo, you would be kicked out of your medical degree. The universities are so hyper-conscious and sensitive about what happens because they need bodies. They don't want people to stop donating.
Can we talk about perhaps that change in perception, that shift from the donors were just someone that was a body to work on, and then the shift that you see now where there is actually memorials that are dedicated to the body donors, and there's ceremonies that are actually undertaken on an annual basis to recognise their contribution. Can you talk us through that sort of evolution that you've seen through time for that?
Oh, yeah, it's really, really fascinating, actually. In the contemporary setting, since about the 60s, medical schools have started holding ceremonies. And the reason why, for example, the University of Queensland did start holding ceremonies is that because people would donate a body and then the family would just never hear anything. They were like, well, what's happening? And so over time, the universities have realised that they need to communicate more with the families. So it doesn't happen everywhere, but in Australia, for example, there'll be a ceremony, the families will come, the medical students will speak. And in some instances now around the world, they're building memorials. So if you go to Rookwood Cemetery in Sydney, there's the body donor memorial there. If you go to the University of Melbourne, there's quite a beautiful sculpture that was built by a woman whose mother donated her body. So you have these rituals, and so it's kind of known as the humane anatomy movement. And particularly in parts of Asia, there's a really fascinating medical school in Taiwan where the students actually know who the donor is. They know everything about them, the person's pictures on the wall. They go and meet the family and talk about, who this person is. And it's this sort of view that it's their first patient. Every medical school is really different. Some of them will tell their students the name of their body, like, someone's, oh, this was Jackie, this is Catherine. Other medical schools don't really do that. Some medical schools will tell, the students will know what they died from. For other students, it's a process of discovery. It doesn't happen a lot, I think, especially as well because students don't really dissect like they used to. Nowadays, they'll get what's called a prosection. So they'll get like an arm or a leg. So they don't really have that intense engagement. But yeah, there's definitely anatomists that take the ethics and how people relate to the corpse quite seriously. Or the cadaver, I don't know, it's really hard to know what to call them. Body donor. I mean, they've got all sorts of names.
And I think that's what strikes me throughout this entire book is that it's just really inconsistent. There's no overarching, policy, procedure, terminology used. It seems to be according to the university or the institution in which you're speaking with. Would that be correct?
Oh my gosh, they're like kind of, governed into the inch of their life. But I think there's just cultural practices. Like they've all got different equipment. They might have different embalming fluid. They might offer different dissection programs. So that's why I'm just cautious about generalizing. So if there's people that are thinking of donating their body, it really depends which city you live in. Like, unfortunately, if you live in regional Australia, like it's not as easy to donate your body. In fact, it's probably impossible. And so it's worthwhile if you are thinking of donating your body to ring up the university and try and find out some information. The other thing too is that they might not always accept your body. It's very interesting working on the book. When the book came out, I got quite a few messages from people saying that their mother had signed up, but the university didn't take the body. So sometimes the university actually might have too many bodies. It might be closed over Christmas. So it's not like you're always guaranteed to go there.
Because I'm assuming it would come down to logistics because there would be a time frame after death that you would have to be embalmed, I suppose, for the tissue to be in the best condition. And that's a real logistical sort of issue if you're in a regional area, if it's during the holidays, those sorts of considerations. And what are some of the other reasons why you found that have been the motivator for people to donate their bodies?
Yeah, this is a really great area, actually. Why would you do it? I mean, I personally wouldn't donate my body, but it's not because of what I found out, but it's also because of my age. Like on average, people really start thinking about donation in their 60s and 70s. But yeah, so there's a scientist called Dr. Sophie Bolt in the Netherlands, who's one of the few people in the world that studied whole body donors. And it's really interesting. There's bits of research around the world, but the thing that I found really funny was that you'd think that the main reason people donate their bodies is because they want to help science, which is obviously true in a sense, but also there's all these other different reasons, including the fact that some people really don't like funerals, and in particular, they don't want a particular person at the funeral. So they would rather get dissected than have a person at the funeral.
Wow.
Another kind of fascinating area is that a lot of donors think that their body is particularly interesting. So they may have had some condition and it was funny when I was working on the book, people would say, oh yeah, I'd be a good body donor. I had this like kind of metal plate put in my shoulder. I think the main thing that I find incredible though is that a lot of people donate their body because they actually want to be dissected. I mean, they're fine with it. They don't have a big deal. I mean, I don't know. What do you think, Catherine? Would you donate your body?
I don't know, Jackie. I read your book over the Christmas period and I was tossing up with that question the entire time I was reading it. And I would go between, yes, I don't have a problem because my best friend who's a doctor has always said that she would donate her body. That's what she wants to do. That's without a doubt. And she's always had an admiration for science and wants her body to be used for scientific purposes and training. I don't know. I don't know whether I could. And I think it's more because I don't know whether my family would be comfortable with it. So it's a conversation that I'll need to have with them because at the end of the day, I'm not going to be doing anything with it. So I suppose if it can be used for someone else to actually learn something, they can go for it. As long as my family's comfortable, I'd say.
Yeah, and I think that's really an important point actually because it's quite easy to sign up, right? Because you die and then you get cut up, right?
Yeah.
But I think it's for the people left behind. It can be very, like you can imagine what's happening to their body. And in fact, one anatomist told me that people do want to watch dissections and they want to find out what happened to their loved one. They want to be there. And, under the law, they're not allowed to. I personally think, if you want to watch your relative be dissected, I'm not sure why the system doesn't want you to. Some might disagree with that. But yeah, I think it is kind of not an easy thing for the survivors. But then again, I've spoken at a few body donor memorials now because let's face it, there's not many dissection writers out there.
How many would there be, Jackie?
Yeah, I know.
Probably a handful.
As you can see, like it's a huge genre at academics and dissection memoirs. And so, speaking to some family members, it had really different meanings for some of them. And for some of them, I think it actually really helped them with the grief process. For others, I'm not sure. I think they were probably a bit still in a state of shock. It's hard to tell. But the body donor memorial services were a really interesting insight for me about. I got the feeling that a lot of people afterwards were inspired to donate because, just seeing the impact that it had on students and the medical school and how helpful it is. I don't have a view on whether you should donate or not. It really is a personal decision.
Yeah, it really is. And how much do you think that, because body donation is one choice that you can make at end of life, how much do you think that with the movement from us caring for our dead and dying in the home at sort of perhaps the turn of the century to now sort of being more the end of life and dying process sort of more happening in a hospital and happening in an aged care facility, and perhaps because we're an aging population, how much do you think that change has also perhaps had an impact in our connection to considering body donation as an option?
I really couldn't say. I mean, because body donation, the thing that I found is that it's a very small scene. I think a lot of people don't really know about it. Like they kind of have vaguely heard about it, but they've never really thought about it. And so the one thing that was really striking was that, when I was researching the book, I was trying to find family members of donors. I was just trying to find anybody who'd signed up for it, and I just couldn't. And it was only I found two people that had relatives that donated their bodies. And the only reason their relative had done it is because they had been at medical school or they had a really direct connection to it. So I think that body donation, perhaps if you had a nursing home where there was a doctor who was telling everybody that he was going to donate and then he donated, then that might have an impact. The thing that's kind of a bit not really spoken about much is that a lot of people that do donate do it for financial reasons. And within the anatomical community, they are aware that it is a social class thing. So, if you donate your body, the university will pay for your cremation. And so you'll get cremated and then you get a phone call a few years later and you get the ashes back. So people definitely donate to save money. And some anatomists told me that they'll get a phone call from someone saying, oh, yeah, mum always wanted to donate. But the universities are like, we need some paperwork because most universities want to do consent donation.
So it seems very clear that if someone is interested in donating their whole body, that they should really contact their local university and have that conversation with them directly.
Yeah, you got to fill out paperwork. You have to consent to things like, parts of your body might be photographed. And also they really encourage next of kin because you might sign up for it, but then you haven't spoken to your sister or whatever, and she'll just say no. And some anatomists said to me that if a family member says no, they just say, fine, we won't take the body. So, yeah, there's definitely a lot of consent issues around it. But yeah, I don't know, because there is a big shift in the death movement and, this desire for people to take death back from the system. I think people are trying to shift things, but it's a very, very tricky and slow process.
And tell me, Jackie, you started off writing this book and going down these rabbit holes to find out what happened to your grandparents.
Yes.
Did you ever find out? Are you happy to share that? Are you going to?
Well, no, I can tell you they got dissected.
Yep.
And apparently someone told me afterwards that I could have actually really pressured the university to give me more details, but apparently there's some code number or something like that. I could have gotten more details, but I don't know exactly what happened to them, but I know what probably happened. But also the thing that I kind of loved about it was meeting these older surgeons and doctors and what happened to them because of it. I kind of liked that idea that my grandparents, they did something quite odd, which I think quite odd, but, they did something that really trained doctors. Like it really did play a part in helping the future. So, I know now a bit about dissection. I know about embalming. I know about, anatomical museums. I know all the terrible jokes that people told about in the 60s and 70s. I know that anatomy labs are human spaces.
And just the one thing that you mentioned there that we haven't discussed is anatomical museums. So, what are they?
Yeah, so it's quite interesting in Australia. Before we had photography, of course, across the world, body parts were preserved so that scientists and students could study them. And sort of up until kind of the 1930s and 40s across the world, they were open to the public. A lot of people would go in and look at them. But what's sort of happened over time is that they've kind of waned, particularly because you have photography, but also because anatomical knowledge has become sort of more microscopic. So, we don't need to look at a big arm anymore, dissected arm as much as we once did. The thing that I found really interesting is how closed off these museums are now. In Europe, you can see all sorts of incredible. I've been to museums in Copenhagen, in the UK, in Austria, really incredible anatomical museums. I recommend if you're going on a holiday to check them out. They're pretty incredible. But in Australia, they're quite closed off, which I have a few issues with. I find it quite paternalistic. But I guess part of the issue is that there's a lot of ethical problems around these museums that, where did these bodies come from? Usually they're poor, people who died in mental hospitals. So it's anatomy's bad history that's playing out in these museums. I personally think that they should just have a big sign on the door discussing the history of medicine because as we know now, there's probably practices that are happening in medicine today, that in 50 years' time we'll think are really unethical. So I feel like they need to be opened up a bit more, the museums, but they are really confronting though. Like I went to an incredible museum at Sydney Uni, which is not easy to get access to. And they've got like a wall of legs and, incredible dissections. And the thing too is that these museums have the artistry and the skill that has gone into some of these dissections is incredible. Like really, really is incredible. And so you really get a sense of, so I had a groin injury. I think I had like a leg injury from running or something. And so I was really like studying this leg and looking at all the different muscles and going, oh, that's probably why that hurts. And, that's why that bit's, aching. And I mean, they are really, really confronting spaces. I felt quite sick. I'm a pretty squeamish person. And so, yeah, I felt quite confronted. But I felt also that I learned a lot, and I think that people are interested in looking inside their bodies and they do want to learn about what's happening inside. And this is why the Body Worlds exhibition is so popular. Like people want to look inside.
And the thing is that they're sort of like the gatekeepers, really, aren't they? Because it's not like we can look inside ourselves. That's the only way we can access what this looks like is by having access to those museums where that work has been done so it can display those amazing muscles and dissect it in that particular way. So it really is an opportunity that we can't get to see that work, even though that it actually tells so much about ourselves. And it's interesting because you do touch on the ethics around, and I think it was in relation to Melbourne University and the repatriation of First Nations bones back and the work that they've been doing around that. So it's not like there isn't a precedent of discussing hard topics.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, within the anatomical world, you have so many different camps, and there are some anatomists that are absolutely engaged in the ethics, and, some scientists want to go to work and do their job. But, I would say generally in Australia, there are a lot of people thinking about what's the right way, what to do with the bodies. I mean, a really fascinating problem is the skeletons. So a lot of older doctors, I've got like a family friend, he's got a skeleton at home and he doesn't know what to do with it. And they're all real human skeletons because in the 1930s up until the 1980s, there was a huge skeleton trade out of India. So much so that the different skulls have got like brands on them, and there was actually a union for bone skeleton dealers. So there's a big movement now as well with the skeletons in anatomy, across the board, all these doctors that have got skeletons, they just don't know what to do with them. So that's sort of another issue that is sort of popping up, what to do with these, because it's basically, it's a dead person in their garage.
Yeah. And, how do you respectfully dispose of that when you don't know who to give it back to either?
I think there is talk of, building some sort of memorial or finding a way to memorialize, but it's a very, very complex space.
And tell me, you visited the memorial that is dedicated to your grandparents and the area where it's dedicated. And how was that for you to go back in that space? And I think from memory, you actually went back there with someone who used to do dissection as well.
Well, no, I went to the graveyard where they were buried. So after they were dissected, yes, they were cremated. And yeah, so I actually went to the graveyard with Leo, who was a technician at Queensland Uni. So I was in Brisbane researching, I interviewed him, and I said, I'm going to go check out my grandparents' grave. So yeah, that was kind of a fascinating experience. I think it was an interesting experience for him as well, because he had not really engaged, he hadn't actually been through this sort of process. So yeah, it was really interesting to go and see their grave. I actually found that there was a plaque missing, so hopefully that's been glued. They've glued one back on.
And how is all of this work? As you said, 4 years of study, so many rabbit holes. How has this impacted your view on end of life options, mortality? How has it impacted you?
I mean, look, writing the book at times, it was quite yucky for me. Like it definitely was confronting at times. When you get into the nitty gritty of dissection, it's really gross. Like it is, cutting off fat, and they, some older surgeons told me kind of quite detailed, gory stuff. So, and then you look at old photographs of dissection from the 1930s and 40s. There was a tradition where medical students would pose with the bodies. And so I was kind of like freaked out at times about sort of the detail of dissection. It's pretty gross. And I don't know, weirdly enough, I just sort of felt it was sort of a shameful thing to do. I don't know, it was weird. I just went through a lot of different, I think, especially the particulars of dissection. And also I felt, I didn't want to upset my dad and my uncle, like them reading this book about all the gore. But I mean, I got their permission and they were fine. But look, I've always been quite interested in the death space. I grew up in the Philippines. It had an open death culture. So I'd say that, yeah, like I went through like some weird times. I had some weird dreams, especially when I went out to the forensic facility, which is a new pathway for donors to go. That was very confronting, seeing sort of, the corpses in various situations. So, yeah, it was definitely, very imaginative, kind of gory dreams at times. But yeah, I feel like I've done my time with death, and not that I let go of it, but yeah, it was just, it is really great to just get into a topic and just go, wow, there are so many threads to it.
Well, Jackie, I have to say, I can't thank you enough for actually going down the rabbit holes that you did, because if it wasn't for the work that you did over that 4 years, we would have had really no idea what it involves and the history of it. You can touch on little bits, but not to the degree in which you've done. So I really thank you for the work that you've done.
Well, thanks for having me on your show, Catherine. It's been lovely chatting.
Thanks, Jackie.
Don't be caught dead forgetting to subscribe. And here are some more videos we know you'll love.